What are you going to do with your life? It's a question we all have to answer at some point in time. For many of you, that time is right around the corner, or maybe you're in the middle of it right now. For me, the answer to that question when I first started college was, I'm going to work in computer science. At least for right now, it's very clearly not happening. So the ending of the story I'm about to tell you will come as no surprise. After leaving a trail of mediocrity behind me for the course of the entire semester, it was time to take the final exam for my intro-level computer science class. And it started out well enough. I answered a few multiple choice questions, even felt good about some of the short answers I wrote, and then I flipped to page 4. Page 4 was an entire sheet of paper filled with straight computer coding. I'm not kidding. It looked like this. Actually, there was just a slight difference. Picture this, but with entire sections just missing. I was supposed to know how to fill those in. Now, this is the point where I, and maybe you, would just make something up. But I had nothing. I didn't even know where to begin to make something up. Do you know that feeling? Maybe someone asks you a question like this. If everything in the universe, including atoms and particles, stops moving, does time stop too? Or maybe the question is, how do you consciously know that you exist? When you're asked questions like these, your mind goes blank. You have no idea how to respond. Questions like these aren't just asked in our day-to-day lives, and they aren't asked of us just as individuals either. Questions like these, the ones we don't have answers to, have implications worldwide. Why do things that plague the world exist, and what can we do about it? Issues like world hunger, a lack of access to clean water, violence and war, natural disasters, lack of medical access for treatable illnesses, homelessness, addiction, the list goes on and on and on. Issues like these, and others that demonstrate the existence of hurt, pain, and suffering in the world around us, can make some of us wonder, what can I do about that? For others, our attention turns to God, and we can make that turn for reassurance or guidance, but our minds can take us in a different direction, one where we begin to ponder the question we're going to look at today. When people are hurting, where is God? Now, some of you haven't thought about this question before, and that's okay. I want to invite you to think about it today. Others of you have had this question, but maybe you haven't let your mind go there because you thought you weren't allowed or would make someone angry. I'm here to tell you today that you are allowed to ask. I'm encouraging you to ask here with us for the next 4 weeks. Because when it comes to topics like these and where God fits into the equation, you might find yourself thinking, I have questions. To tackle the question, when people are hurting, where is God? We're going to look at a story in the Old Testament about a young woman named Esther. This story shows a lot about Esther's character, bravery, and sacrifice. But as we go through it, I want you to ask yourself the question, where is God? Our story begins when Esther is chosen to become the queen of a nation called Persia. Seems simple enough, but what most people in the story don't know is that Esther is Jewish. The king of Persia certainly wasn't equipped with this information when he chose Esther to be his wife. One of the king's key advisors was a man named Haman, a political leader who just so happened to be plotting to eradicate every Jewish person in the kingdom. Pretty scary coincidence, and one that gets even scarier when Haman convinces the king to agree to his plan. Esther's cousin Mordecai learns about this plan and knows that he has to act. He urges Esther to speak to the king, stop the execution, and rescue the Jewish people. Again, this seems simple enough, but it's important to note that this wasn't a typical conversation between husband and wife. No one, not even Queen Esther, was allowed to speak to the king without his permission or invitation. Going straight to the king without his approval could have resulted in Esther's death and the death of her people. So, what does Esther say in response to Mordecai? All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." We see that Esther decides to act, but when she does, it's not recklessly. After speaking these words, she invites the king to a banquet where she plans to make her request. At the feast, instead of making her request, she invites the king to a second banquet where she promises to make her request then. The next day, the king and Haman arrive at the banquet ready to hear what Esther has to say, and here's what ends up happening. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining just as the king was returning from the palace garden. The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai." I didn't quite finish the story, but let's just say that Haman was punished. Justice was served. Esther, Mordecai, and their people are saved. So remember the question I told you to ask yourself. Where is God? Don't feel bad if you think you missed it. You aren't crazy. In this entire book of the Bible, God is never mentioned, not even once. So, where was God when the Jewish people were hurting and in danger? Based on what we just established, that's a valid question. But even though he's not mentioned, this story shows us 3 important truths about who God is and how he works. The first one is that God was present. You may have noticed, but we can't tangibly see God in our day-to-day lives. But just because we can't see him in this book or in the flesh doesn't mean God isn't present. What made Esther tell the king about the plot against her people at the second banquet but not the first? Why was Haman not at the first banquet but attended the second? If you read between the lines, you can see that God was there. He never left or forgot the Jewish people. Which leads to our second point. God was working. The book of Esther and much of the Bible show that God is always behind those in need. He's always working for justice against oppression. In Esther's story, Haman was the oppressor, and the Jewish people were the ones in need. God was working to rescue them, but in a way they couldn't see or maybe didn't expect. What way was that? God used Esther. There's a moment in this story where God is almost mentioned. When Mordecai tells Esther what she must do, she asks Mordecai and her people to pray for her. God answers that prayer, not by intervening himself, but by giving guidance and strength to Esther. Esther and God both heard the cries of the Jewish, and they both decided that something had to be done. But Esther never could have done what she did on her own. We see God actively working through Esther by placing her in a position of influence and authority long before she ever needed it or understood why she had been chosen. We can see God give Esther courage in a dangerous situation and creativity to solve a difficult problem. And we see God rescue Esther and her people when everything seems hopeless. Isn't it interesting how even as God does all of this through Esther, he never tells her exactly what to do? As far as we know, God doesn't speak to Esther in any miraculous way or give her the game plan. But Esther still knows what God wants her to do. How? Believe it or not, the answer is pretty simple. In situations like the one Esther faces, God's directions to us have always been clear. When you see someone in need, help them. Jesus said this very truth when he was on earth, and John, one of Jesus' disciples, repeated these instructions. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need but shows no compassion, how can God's love be in that person? Dear children, let's not merely say we love each other. Let us show the truth by our actions. So where is God when people are hurting? The answer was true in Esther's time, and it's still true for us today. God is present, God is working, and God is calling you. So think back to some of the problems our world faces today, like war, hunger, violence, and many more. When we see all the pain in the world around us, it's easy to feel the weight of it all. And it's easy to feel like you're unable to see God through it all. When you feel overwhelmed by all that's broken, it's okay to ask the tough questions, even to ask God, where are you? But even when we can't see God working, we can know from the story of Esther and countless others that he answers prayers, he changes circumstances, he provides peace and comfort, and he sends people to help. And sometimes those people are you and me. Although our world today is very different from Esther's, some things haven't changed. People are persecuted, hated, or in need of help because of the country they reside in, their religious beliefs, culture, skin color, body shape, nationality, disability, physical or mental health, and so much more. But we don't have to feel burdened, confused, stuck, or powerless. Like Esther did, we can choose to do something with the resources God has given us to help people who are hurting. Like Esther, maybe you are alive right now in the place you are for this very moment in time. So when people are hurting, where is God? He's still present. He's at work behind the scenes, and he's calling you to help.